Hi, I'm Tim Lewis and I'm trying to visit all 50 states of the US. My original goal was to visit all 50 states before I was 50, but unfortunately then the pandemic thing happened, so I wasn't able to. But in 2022 I visited 20 states of the US, two of which I visited before, and I visited quite a few new places in the US. And this video is part one of the videos I'm going to make about the top 10 new places in the US that I visited. So enjoy. At number 10, we have Fargo, North Dakota. So why did I pick Fargo as my 10th city? Well, it's only narrowly beat Salt Lake City, and that's purely down to one attraction. But there are several things to do in the area. Apart from this one attraction, most of them are not that impressive, to be honest. The Plains Art Museum is okay. It's not especially great. It's not a terrible art museum. It's just there's not much to it. It's a very nice venue, but it's not a great art exhibit. There's only about 2 floors of stuff to see there. The Red River Zoo, which I also visited, has to be one of the most underwhelming zoos I've ever been to, but it's quite pleasant, and I don't think it was particularly expensive either. And similarly, something that I found peculiar is that the Fargo Visitor Centre had very good reviews on TripAdvisor, but I was very underwhelmed by that. I think it's mainly because it's got a lot of things from either the Fargo film or Fargo TV show that I don't understand. So that's why I was underwhelmed with it. But it's very small. They've only got a few exhibits there, and it's not, in my opinion, worth visiting unless you happen to be in the area. Probably the second best attraction was the Fargo Air Museum near the airport. And even the problem was I'd come recently from Seattle. Seattle's Air Museum is miles better than virtually any other air museum I've seen anywhere in the world. So in comparison, the Fargo Air Museum was quite underwhelming. Now the reason that Fargo is on the list over Salt Lake City is because of the Chemscourt Centre. Basically this building, fairly reasonable sized building just over the river from Fargo in Moorhead, where the major exhibit is this replica Viking ship. And I was thinking, you just turn up there and it's like, is this an enormous Viking ship? And I'm like, what? What's this doing in North America? So the background is that there was this guy in the 1970s, I think, 1980s, who decided that he wanted to try and build a replica Viking ship and sail it from the Great Lakes all the way to Norway. Now, the guy actually died before the project was completed, but then his family and other volunteers took it over, and they actually did sail this ship, the Chemscourt, from the Great Lakes in Minnesota all the way through the Great Lakes, all the way to Norway. And this whole exhibit and the ship that they sailed in is all in this centre, and it's just really amazing. I was just blown away by this particular exhibit. So that's why Fargo is above Salt Lake City on the list, even though Salt Lake City has probably got more good attractions than Fargo. But just to visit the Chemscourt Centre is worth it for me. At number 9 we have Fort Smith, Arkansas. Now, Fort Smith is higher up on this list than maybe it should be on the basis of attractions alone, just because it's so different from so many of the other places on the list. Very much in what would have been the Old West on the border with Oklahoma. And it's a really nice little town, and while the attractions aren't necessarily as great as some of the other ones around, I've rated it here because of that just feeling of differentness. Also, there were several other interesting looking attractions that were actually closed due to the time of the week that I went to Fort Smith, so that's another thing in its favour. First up we have the Fort Smith Regional Art Museum, which to be honest is a little bit disappointing. It's a free museum though, if I remember correctly, and it's really just not very much there. There's a few exhibits that are quite interesting, but it's literally 2 floors and there's not much there to really look at. It's a little bit of a walk from the centre as well, so I wouldn't recommend going out of your way unless you particularly love art to go and see this particular attraction. The Fort Smith Museum of History is a reasonable museum about Fort Smith and the local area. Slightly overlaps with the Fort Smith National Historic Site, which is coming up soon, in terms of its coverage, but it's a reasonable museum. I wouldn't say it's a must-see museum, but lots of reasonable collections. Quite an interesting exhibit about television production, which may or may not be a permanent one, I'm not sure. The Fort Smith National Historic Site is the site of the old fort that used to be at Fort Smith. And inside that building is a museum which is really interesting about the history of Fort Smith as a frontier town. Though most of its frontier nature was because of the fact that Oklahoma, more or less as it is now, was deemed as Indian territory, which meant that it was governed by Native Americans, but they weren't given any jurisdiction over non-Native Americans. So you had this weird situation where lots of outlaws and vagabonds and other people who were on the run for offences in places like Arkansas ended up in the Oklahoma territory, and this happened for about 30 or 40 years. They didn't sort of tie up this loophole, so they ended up having to appoint deputies to ride into Oklahoma from Arkansas, and specifically Fort Smith, to go and clear it up. And the museum is mainly about that. So there's lots about the deputies and the judges and the things for cleaning up this mess of this loophole with the legal system that made Oklahoma so lawless. And yeah, it's a really interesting site and museum to visit. I found the whole thing really interesting. At number 8 we have Mobile, Alabama. So, Mobile in Alabama is on my list because it has a really great range of attractions compared to somewhere like Fargo. The place itself is a little run down, though I did visit immediately after the pandemic, so that may not be Mobile's fault, it may not be like that normally. Starting with the weakest attraction that I visited is the Gulf Quest Centre, and this is a museum about the history of shipping and shipping containers. It's not a bad museum. It's just, it didn't really inspire my interest in anything, and they had a big space and they had lots of attractions, but half of them didn't seem to be working properly, and yeah, it seemed a bit neglected, but that could have been the result of the pandemic. So I wouldn't necessarily write off the Gulf Quest Centre, but it wouldn't be the first place I visit in Mobile, Alabama. Next up, it's the History Museum of Mobile, which is really good. There's an awful lot of interesting stuff in that museum, including an exhibition about Vikings. I don't know what it is with the US, but there seems to be an awful lot of interesting Vikings in the US for some reason, certainly in museums and the like. There's a whole section about Vikings in this History Museum in Mobile. But there's lots of interesting stuff about Mobile and the area itself, and it's a pretty good museum actually. For these regional museums, it's one of the better ones I've been to. In terms of the next attraction up, this was very neck and neck with the History Museum of Mobile, the Mobile Carnival Museum, or also known as the Mardi Gras Museum. There's a whole load of exhibits from Mardi Gras carnivals, and Mardi Gras actually started in Mobile rather than New Orleans, as many people don't know. So every year there is a Mardi Gras celebration in Mobile, which apparently is a lot more civilized than the one in New Orleans, if you believe the museum in Mobile. It's a really interesting little museum. It's nowhere near as big as the History Museum, but yeah, it's a very interesting museum to visit, and there's lots of good displays there. And the number one attraction in Mobile, in my opinion, is the USS Alabama Battleship Memorial Park. For a start, you've got a battleship. You can go around and tour the USS Alabama. And then the park around it has also got lots and lots and lots of military kit just sitting around there. It's quite a big park, and there's quite a wider range of military equipment. Now, obviously, if you're not into military equipment, then you might not find this as fascinating as I did. but I thought it's amongst the best of those kind of exhibits in the US, and I've been to quite a lot of them. A lot of aircraft carriers and submarines and various other things. I haven't actually been to a battleship before, so maybe some of the other battleships floating around the coast somewhere might be better, but in my experience this was a really good place to visit. So that's it for part 1. In the next video I'm going to talk about the next 3 on the list. I created one enormous 40-minute video with all of these in, and then I thought nobody's going to watch that, so that's why I've chopped it up into multiple parts. So you can watch the next episode here, hopefully, if the link works. See you then.